This morning, thousands of children that were taken from their parents. That's exactly the question they're asking. What is in store for them? Where are they going to go? After the president did sign that executive order that ends the practice of separating families, something his administration said only Congress can do. And then the president did it. This is a big positive for those who are trying to cross the border now. They will hopefully not have to face this. And they realize they're going to have to face repercussions. When you come in the country illegally, you will be detained. You will be arrested. But now the idea that these families will stay together is a relief. It's a positive. More than 2,300 children, they've already been separated. And the order, it's doing nothing to reunite them with their parents, not even the intention. There's no policy put in place. It is an immense task. Now, given that many of them, as I just said, they were on my plane yesterday, they have been relocated to states as far away as Michigan, Connecticut, and right here in New York, and sometimes without the knowledge of local officials. And the rollout of this fix, it seems nearly as confused as the policy itself. After Health and Human Services spokesperson Ken Wolf said the children already separated would not be reunited. Another official said Wolf misspoke, saying reunification is always the goal. I appreciate the spirit of that. It's always the goal. What I want to know is, what is the procedure? We'll be following it. And the department is awaiting further guidance on that matter. So for me, the only guidance I got from the person in the White House who's focused on family issues and children, which is Ivanka, is she was thanking her dad for ending the policy that he put in place and said it's Congress's turn. It's Congress's turn to do something, but the job is not over in the executive branch. Again, please, Ivanka, do something. Joining me now, NBC News national correspondent Peter Alexander, NBC News national security and justice reporter Julia Ainsley, and Carlos Garcia, an immigration attorney live in McAllen, Texas. Okie doke. Peter, I'm desperate to know this. What exactly does this do for families who are already separated? Those kids and their mamas, they don't have the bracelets on that your wife and I had when we were in the hospital having our babies to make sure we didn't leave the building without one another.
Yes, Stephanie, say nothing of the fact that many of those young children are not in positions to advocate for themselves. Remember, some of them are under the age of 4 years old right now. So the administration rolled out this policy. Now the tough task is trying to roll it back, as it were, to try to fix this diaspora of these young undocumented immigrants all over the country right now. As you just indicated, we've already heard from the HHS, for the Health and Human Services Department right now, effectively, that they haven't received any additional guidance on this matter yet. It is unclear how soon, certainly not immediately, that these families will be reunited. And there are obviously unique circumstances here that make this an even more complicated process than it already was at face value. Let me put up on your screen part of that executive order from the president yesterday, and how it details some of the challenges here. It says the Secretary of Homeland Security shall not, however, detain an alien family together when there is a concern that detention of an alien child with the child's alien parent would pose a risk to the child's welfare. So on top of the fundamental challenge that exists right now of trying to put parents back together with their children are these unique circumstances as it relates to some of these children. And certainly in some of these cases, the children may have been brought here by those other than their parents, at least according to the administration. Stephanie?
Okay, Peter, I want to walk through local officials, it sounds like, or excuse me, elected officials might be touring these centers. It was very frustrating when we were down there. We couldn't get in. What do you know about that?
Well, what we do know, at least one example, was Senator Bill Nelson in Homestead, Florida, just a matter of days ago, was trying to get into one of these detention centers where young people were being held in his home state. He was unable to do it, obviously was very frustrated by that. He described it as a cover-up after he was denied access to this immigration center in Homestead, Florida, where they were holding more than 1,000 migrant teenagers, including 94 reportedly who were separated from their parents. Whether he's going to get to go in there at any point, we do not know just yet. That's obviously, as you've indicated, not the only site where there have been problems and where officials have been turned away. We've witnessed that playing out over the course of the last several days. And on screen right now, we're showing you some of the pictures in the video, not independently shot by journalistic organizations, but provided by Health and Human Services, provided by the Trump administration. All the more reason why these lawmakers and journalists want access on their own to try to detail exactly what it looks like behind the scenes there, Steph.
Okay, Julia, walk us through this. You know, when we say the president signed an executive order to end zero tolerance, you know, it makes for a good headline. But walk us through what it actually means, because the wording is actually very vague. And in the past, when he signs these orders, it doesn't end up meaning that there's action. It really ends up meaning that they write reports.
That's true, Stephanie. And actually, no matter what side of the immigration issue you land on, this executive order is very vague. In fact, we've just gotten some reporting from Chris Hayes, who's in touch with people in court in McAllen, Texas, who said that 17 immigrants came in today who were supposed to be charged in federal court, as they would under the zero tolerance policy, with misdemeanors, but they were not charged so they could stay with their family. That is not the zero tolerance policy. So for the president to say he will continue zero tolerance but allow families to reunify, you can't have both of those things. And so, in fact, they're throwing out those misdemeanors, at least now, at least in these 17 cases that Chris heard about today. And part of that is just the technicalities. If you charge someone in federal court, you have to hold them in the custody of the U.S. Marshals, and you can't hold children there. If you're going to hold families together, they'd be in family detention centers where often people are going through civil proceedings. That would be getting an asylum claim or just simply getting an order of deportation. So none of this makes sense. I mean, they're from where the children are to where these people are going to stay. We understand the Department of Defense is looking into places where families can stay, to whether or not people will even be charged for crossing the border illegally, as the president said they would be. It all just seems to be floating in the air right now, Stephanie.
Okay, Carlos, I want to stick sort of to what technically happens here, because politics and agendas and advocacy, put all of that aside, and let's go technical. You were just in the federal court when the judge decided that those 17 people would not be charged. So they're not going to be charged, but for new migrants coming in, what can they expect?
I have no idea. Well, let me just clarify something. I was in the courtroom. The judge did not take the bench. The government attorneys were not inside the courtroom yet. The federal public defenders got word that those 17 people were not going to be charged, likely from the AUSAs, the government, and those 17 people were taken off the docket. So there was no formal proceeding, and their cases were dismissed. Now, what comes next? We don't know. We don't know if now parents with children are going to continue being charged for illegal entry, or what's going to happen. These 17 people whose cases were dismissed, their children have already been taken away from them. Their children are nowhere to be found right now. So we don't know if the reunification process starts with them or it's going to start later, but their kids are gone.
Okay, but when you say their kids are gone, let's just talk through the reunification process. So President Trump says he wants to end zero tolerance. We've got over 2,000 kids that are separated from their parents. What is the procedure that happens now to reunite them? Carlos.
So now they go through, if they're in ORR custody, if they're in the government's custody, ORR is Office of Refugee and Resettlement, and they're the ones that take care of the kids, and they have caseworkers, and those caseworkers try to reunify them with an existing family member that may be in the United States, if that's going to be possible. Because remember, despite the fact that these parents have their criminal case dismissed, that doesn't mean that that ICE isn't going to pick them up and that they're not going to be transferred to ICE. So we'll have to wait and see what happens to these 17 people. And if they make an affirmative claim for asylum, they might go through that process.
And just help me understand one more time. Why would the parents have their criminal case dismissed if they did cross the border illegally and they were detained by border agents? Why is it being dismissed?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that question. I think that question is better answered by the government.
Julia? I know you're not the government, but can you answer this?
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, it seems, Stephanie, that there's just confusion, that these people down at the border are not understanding how they're supposed to interpret the executive order. It's the same confusion through all of these agencies, and we're seeing it in the judicial branch as well. I'm sure they'll want clarification, but you would have thought that would have already come. I stayed up all night waiting for statements from government agencies, turning over, resetting my alarm, expecting there to be clarification. We don't have those answers yet.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos. here. To watch the latest interviews and highlights, you can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.